If you ask anyone what is the best value right now in the Mac lineup, I think most people would answer the Mac Mini. And that always wasn't necessarily the case. Sometimes the Mac Mini was not really a good value or a good computer, but when Apple released Apple Silicon and they put the M1 chip into the new Mac Mini, they made it into a valuable little powerhouse of a desktop computer. And I think that's why I'm actually the most excited out of all of these new Apple Silicon computers we're supposed to get next year for the new M2 Mac Mini, because it is always such an easy recommendation for the current M1 Mac Mini. And some of the rumors and leaks right now regarding the next M2 Mac Mini are actually even more exciting when it comes from a value and a power perspective. So for today's video, I want to talk about everything we know so far about the new M2 Mac Mini, and how there might actually be more than one. But let's start with the basics. Let's start with that M1 Mac Mini upgrade. Now, when you think about an upgrade to the Mac Mini, it's very easy to let your mind race and think about like a wild new redesign. It's been a while since the Mac Mini's got a redesign, and even looking at the current M1 Mac Mini, it does look a little bit old in this Apple lineup. But I would say that we probably should not expect any sort of redesign for a base level Mac Mini, just based on Apple's recent history with them updating older products in the lineup, like the M2 MacBook Pro with the Touch Bar. They are not afraid to keep an older design in the lineup, and it looks like, based on all the rumors so far, there's really not a lot of concrete evidence about the M2 Mac Mini getting any sort of sweeping redesign. So I think for this M2 Mac Mini, we can expect a spec bump update. And normally that might be kind of boring, but I think for this M2 Mac Mini, it's actually pretty good, because the current Mac Mini, again, it's a really good value. So just delivering more on that $699 entry-level price point and upgrading the M2 chip to deliver a better CPU and maybe even more importantly, a better GPU inside of that desktop computer is just going to continue to make it a great value. But I think probably the most important thing when it comes to the M2 Mac Mini being a better value as it gets this spec bump upgrade is to remember what the M2 chip brought to the laptop lineup, and that was actually the addition of more memory. So with the new M2 chip, you can now max out the memory up to 24 gigabytes instead of 16 gigabytes. And I've always said, even in my initial review of the Mac Mini and all the M1 computers, one of the hardest things about them to recommend was that hard ceiling limit of just 16 gigabytes of memory. Like, even for myself, as someone who I really don't think my work's like all too intensive with using Final Cut Pro for video editing, I can make 16 gigabytes work, but there were times where I hit that limit of memory and I would experience slowdowns on my older 16 gigabyte M1 machines. And I just feel like with a little bit of extra headroom, if you gave me like a 24 gigabyte option back then, I actually think I might have actually managed to be pretty fine using a computer like that. So I think that's an important upgrade to make for this Mac Mini. It's going to be a computer that could reach a wider audience of people who are getting into more intensive tasks, and having that ability to have extra memory bandwidth is going to make it a more broad recommendation across the board. Now, of course, I think we can expect the base level configuration to stay the same. I think it's going to stay at $699 for 256 gigabytes of storage and 8 gigabytes of memory. That seems in line with the rest of the M2 updates. That's the memory and storage they start at, and I don't foresee a price increase on an M2 Mac Mini, especially if it's keeping the same design. Okay, but let's talk about something a little bit more exciting, and that is the new, or I guess the new rumored M2 Pro Mac Mini. Now, this is going to be a separate version of the Mac Mini that is at a higher end. So one of the things I talked about with that M2 update was that it was going to reach a broader audience by being able to be spec'd up higher to 24 gigabytes of memory. Well, if that wasn't enough for you, this M2 Pro chip is going to fill that gap even more. And I think this could potentially be the best performance budget machine in the entire Mac lineup when it's released. Now, designed for this Mac Mini, there were some rumors about some sort of Mac Mini redesign, it getting kind of like a flatter overall profile and a plexiglass top. Now, as we were going into 2022 and we thought these Macs were going to be coming out during that period, there were no rumors about a redesign towards the tail end, so I was kind of expecting it not to get a redesign. But as we go further and further away from these things being released, the current time frame is looking like March for this M2 Mac Mini, and now this M2 Pro Mac Mini, there is potential for a shakeup here in a redesign. So there were rumors of like a flatter overall design with a plexiglass top. Maybe that does happen, but I would say there are some things going against this M2 Pro Mac Mini getting a redesign, and I would say the thing that points to it not getting a redesign is the Mac Studio. Like, look at the Mac Studio. It just looks like a taller, fatter version of a Mac Mini, and because Apple kept that design for the Mac Studio, it makes me think personally that an M2 Pro Mac Mini is gonna look the same as the current space gray Intel Mac Mini. I really think it's just gonna have that same design based on the Mac Studio. Like, why would the Mac Mini get like a different design shift when we have the Mac Studio? But that isn't necessarily a bad thing either, because I think there could be like some small updates to the M2 Mac Mini design to actually make it a little bit better. And one of those things that I think could happen to an M2 Pro version of the Mac Mini is some better port selection, because the current Intel Mac Mini has a pretty wide range of ports. It has 4 of those Thunderbolt ports compared to the 2 on the M1 Mac Mini. And I think with Apple's recent embrace of ports like the SD card slot, I think there's a pretty good chance a Pro version of the Mac Mini could have the SD card slot included, and I think it will be on the front of the machine like we just got on the recent Mac Studio. But again, design like this, like there's some design improvements on this M2 Pro Mac Mini that they could make to make it a better Pro desktop. But let's be honest, for a desktop Mac like this, what really matters is the specs inside of it. And why would you get an M2 Pro Mac Mini over a regular M2 Mac Mini is going to be the M2 Pro chip. And the rumors for this M2 Pro chip is actually pretty favorable now, now that it's kind of been, I guess, delayed until March. Potentially because now there's more rumors that these chips are going to be more significant upgrades, because before we heard rumors that the M2 Pro chip was just going to be kind of like a slight modification, very similar to the spec bump from the M1 to the M2, and it was going to keep the same 10 CPU core design. But now there's rumors floating around that the M2 Pro is actually going to have a 12 core CPU design. So it's going to have 2 more additional cores on top of the fact that all those cores are going to be more powerful in single-threaded performance. So this is a really, really good thing for the M2 Pro chip. It means it's going to have faster single-core performance, and then more importantly, that multi-core performance, especially if it gets those 2 additional cores, it sounds like it's going to be really powerful. And then the rumors for the M2 Pro GPU being stronger were already really good. Most of the improvement in power to the M2 chip actually went to the GPU, and the M2 Pro chip was already rumored to be getting around a 20-core GPU. So again, these are all really good indications that this M2 Pro Mac Mini is going to be a little beast in terms of performance. And similar to the story with the M2 chip, where it got more memory, maybe that's also in the cards for the M2 Pro chip as well. So currently, you can max out the M2 Pro at 32 gigabytes of unified memory, and if we were to follow the same memory bandwidth increase with the regular M2 chip, that means we could get an M2 Pro configuration with up to 40 gigabytes of memory. Now, if you're wondering if there's going to be an M2 Max version of this Mac Mini, it's probably unlikely. And why is it unlikely? Well, it means that there's no reason for the Mac Studio to exist, right? The Mac Studio starts at the M1 Max chip. When the M2 Max comes out, I'm sure the Mac Studio will get an update sooner or later. And that's where you go to get your desktop M2 Max chip. So don't expect an M2 Max for this Mac Mini. It's going to probably max out on the Pro chip. Okay, as for a release date, much like the M2 Mac Mini, the rumors are currently pointing towards a March release date. That apparently is when Apple is going to refresh a lot of the Macs in their Apple Silicon lineup with new M2 Pro chips, new M2 chips, and M2 Max chips. So expect a release of the Mac Mini then, probably alongside like a bunch of other Macs like the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. As for the pricing of this Mac Mini, don't forget that Apple still for some reason sells an Intel Mac Mini in space gray on their website, which is just a really bad value, but yeah, they still sell that. And when you look at the pricing there, it's $1,099. Now, I don't think the new M2 Pro Mac Mini is going to start at $1,099 because when you look at that configuration of the Mac Mini, it is lacking something that Apple will definitely charge more money for. and that is the memory. So right now it does start at 512 gigabytes of storage, which is the same amount of storage that the M1 Pro machine starts at for the MacBook Pro. So, okay, you can probably keep the price there for that, but it does just start with 8 gigabytes of memory. And if you look at all the M1 Pro machines that Apple sells, well, the default configuration for that is 16 gigabytes of memory. Apple does not sell you an M1 Pro machine with 8 gigabytes of memory, so I don't think they're going to sell you an M2 Pro machine with just 8 gigabytes of memory. And I think that's going to drive the cost up of this M2 Pro Mac Mini to probably $1,300 with 512 gigabytes of base storage and 16 gigabytes of memory. And if you look at the lineup in total, it just makes a lot of sense, right? $699 for the Mac Mini, you can probably spec that up to around like that $1,300 price point as you start to like max things out. And then if that doesn't do it for you, if you need even more power, then you're gonna start at $1,300 for this M2 Pro Mac Mini and then spec it out from there. But yeah, that's basically everything we know about the new M2 Mac Mini and the new M2 Pro Mac Mini. These are probably the desktop computers that I am the most excited for in the Apple Silicon lineup. I already own an M1 Mac Studio, but I am actually looking for a second production machine. So this is something that I do want to incorporate into my studio setup. So I am personally really excited for the M2 Mac Mini. But let me know in the comments below. Are you excited for an M2 Mac Mini? Are you waiting to buy one until March? And let me know what you're getting, an M2 Mac Mini, like the cheapest version, or do you plan to actually go for this mid-spec desktop tower with an M2 Pro Mac Mini? All right, but hopefully you found this video helpful. Hopefully the wait isn't too long until March. So if you like the video, give me a like. If you want to see more, make sure you're subscribed. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.